Hey everybody, and welcome to this deep dive into Marine Corps doctrine.
Oh, yeah.
We're going to be looking at MCDP 101,
All right.
Chapter 3, Strategic Opposites.
Strategic opposites.
Now, we know that all of you out there listening are dedicated to honing your skills as Marines.
Absolutely.
And understanding strategic thinking is essential no matter what your rank is.
Yeah.
So today we're going to break down some really complex concepts into easy-to-understand pieces.
Yeah, we're going to make it.
We'll share some really interesting historical examples
I love those.
and help you apply these ideas to your own experiences.
That's right.
So to get us started,
Yeah.
the chapter kicks off with this idea, strategic opposites.
Okay. Strategic opposites.
It's not just about comparing who has more tanks or troops, right?
Exactly. Imagine two countries facing off.
Yeah.
One might have a massive military, but their enemy knows the terrain like the back of their hand.
Right.
And their people are fiercely committed to defending their homeland.
They're fighting for their home.
That's a strategic opposite.
Okay.
The tangible strength of one side versus the intangible advantages of the other.
It makes sense.
It's like a game of chess,
Oh, yeah.
where each side has unique strengths and weaknesses,
Huh.
and the winner isn't always the one with the most pieces on the board.
That's true.
Yeah,
So it sounds like it's really about understanding those deeper dynamics,
absolutely.
the motivations,
Yeah,
the strategies, and even like the
you
psychology
got it.
of your opponent.
Yes.
It makes sense that MCDP 1.1 would stress looking beyond just the military hardware.
Absolutely. And one of the most fundamental strategic opposites is the idea of defensive versus offensive strategies.
Okay.
We've all heard of offense versus defense,
Right.
but how does this play out in a larger strategic context?
Yeah, how does that work when you're talking about strategy?
Well, you've got the strategic attacker,
Okay.
the one looking to shake things up, grab more power,
Uh-huh.
and they usually initiate the conflict.
They're the ones starting it.
Though sometimes the defender might launch a preemptive strike.
Oh, interesting.
Then you've got the strategic defender,
Okay.
focused on holding their ground,
Okay.
protecting their territory,
Mm.
their resources, their people, all of that.
Makes sense.
So seems straightforward enough, but I'm guessing there's more to it than meets the eye.
Right. Yeah. Can't be that simple.
Oh, there is.
Okay.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
I like interesting.
The strategic defense actually holds inherent strengths.
Really?
Think about it.
Okay.
People are generally far more willing to fight fiercely to protect their home turf
Yeah.
than they are to go on some far-off campaign.
That makes sense.
That psychological element is huge E.
Yeah.
Plus, the defenders often operating closer to their supply lines, their
Right.
support base,
Right.
while the attackers stretching themselves further and further away.
Okay.
That can create what we call friction and inertia.
Friction and inertia. Two words we don't want to hear on the battlefield.
Think about it like this. Friction in a military sense is anything that slows down or disrupts operations.
Yeah.
The attacker's facing more of it.
Okay.
Their plans are going to get bogged down more easily,
Mm-hmm.
and the further they push, the worse it gets.
Oh, so it gets worse over time.
Inertia, on the other hand, is the tendency for things in motion to stay in motion.
Right.
And in war, it often favors the defender.
Okay.
They're already in place, dug in, harder to dislodge.
So even when the Allies were pushing into Germany in World War II,
Yes.
they were still strategically the defenders,
That's a great example.
even though they were on the offense.
They were pushing back against an aggressor, restoring balance rather than disrupting it.
Okay.
It's crucial to remember that being on the offensive doesn't automatically equal strategic advantage.
I see that.
Yeah.
So when you're analyzing a conflict,
Yeah.
don't just look at who's advancing and who's retreating.
Right?
You got to dig deeper.
You got it.
Ask yourself,
Yeah.
who's really trying to change the status quo and who's trying to preserve it?
Exactly. Now, this doesn't mean the defender always wins, of course.
Right.
Resources, leadership, technology, all these things matter immensely.
Of course.
But generally speaking, that strategic defense has a built-in edge.
Something to think about.
Right.
Right. Were there any conflicts where the roles of attacker and defender might have shifted during the fight?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Something to ponder
Yeah.
as we move on to another key set of opposites.
Okay.
Symmetrical versus asymmetrical strategies.
Oh, this one's a game changer.
Okay.
Symmetrical strategies are about matching your opponent, trying to beat them at their own game.
Right.
Asymmetrical strategies are all about exploiting your opponent's weaknesses,
Okay.
using methods they might not be prepared for.
So if symmetrical is like a head-to-head boxing match,
Okay.
asymmetrical is more like using a judo move to catch your opponent off balance.
Yes.
using their strength against them.
A perfect analogy.
Right.
Think about how terrorist organizations like the IRA or the PLO operated. They knew they couldn't take on powerful states with conventional armies.
Right.
So they used guerrilla tactics, bombings, targeted assassinations,
Oh, wow.
disrupting, inflicting damage in ways that conventional forces struggled to counter.
It's almost like trying to fight a shark by nibbling at its fins.
Okay.
You're not going to win a head-on fight,
Right.
so you got to find a different approach.
Exactly.
Right.
And sometimes these asymmetrical strategies aim to provoke a symmetrical response.
Oh, really?
Imagine a terrorist attack designed to incite a government to overreact,
Okay.
taking harsh measures that alienate the population and ultimately play right into the terrorists' hands.
Wow.
It's a calculated approach using the enemy's strengths against them.
That's a chilling thought,
It is.
but it really highlights how important it is to understand these dynamics.
So even in the Cold War,
Yeah.
the U.S. strategy of containment had elements of both.
Okay.
Eisenhower's massive retaliation policy, the threat of a nuclear response to a conventional attack,
Right.
was inherently asymmetrical.
Okay.
But the broader picture,
Yeah.
both the U.S. and the Soviet Union relied heavily on deterrence, which is a more symmetrical approach.
So it's rarely a black and white situation.
Rarely. It's
Got it.
about recognizing when to use each type of strategy and how they can work together.
So how might the USMC utilize both symmetrical and asymmetrical strategies in the conflicts you face today?
That is the question.
That's something for you listening to consider.
Think about that.
And speaking of different approaches, let's talk about deterrence.
Okay. So deterrence is all about preventing an enemy from taking action by presenting a credible counter threat.
Mm-hmm.
It's essentially saying, if you do this, there will be severe consequences.
Okay.
And there are two main methods,
Okay.
denial and reprisal.
Break it down for us.
Okay, denial is about convincing the enemy that their action will fail.
Okay.
Think about strong military defenses deterring a conventional invasion.
Okay.
It's about making the cost of action too high. Reprisal, on the other hand, is about convincing the enemy that the consequences of their action will outweigh any potential gains.
Okay, so denial is like locking your door to deter a burglar,
Yes.
while reprisal is like having a guard dog that will bite if they manage to break in.
Perfect.
Right.
And those methods often work best together.
Uh-huh.
A strong defense backed up by the credible threat of a forceful response
Yeah.
makes for a powerful deterrent.
Right.
But there's a catch.
Well, there's always a catch.
Your deterrent has to be believable.
Right. It's got to be real.
How do you get inside an enemy's head and understand what they perceive as a real threat?
That's where intelligence gathering comes in, right?
Yes.
Analyzing information, understanding the enemy's culture, their motivations, their fears, their values, all of that.
Exactly. You need to be able to read your opponent, understand their tells,
Mm.
and make sure your bluff is convincing.
Knowing when to hold them and when to fold them
Yes.
is just as important in strategic thinking as it is in poker.
It really is. And speaking of knowing when to adapt your approach, that brings us to another set of strategic opposites.
Go.
Standardized versus tailored strategies.
Sorry, so are we talking about pre-made plans
Yes,
versus custom-designed solutions?
you got it.
Okay.
Standardized strategies are your go-to plays.
Mm-hmm.
The things you know will generally work in a given situation.
Okay.
They're great for quick responses
Right.
or familiar problems.
Right.
Tailored strategies are custom designed for specific circumstances.
So standardized is like your playbook
Okay.
for different football scenarios.
Yeah?
Tailored is drawing up a new play to counter your opponent's weaknesses
Great analogy.
in this particular game.
Yeah, and here's the thing. Standardized strategies aren't static.
Right.
They evolve over time based on experience.
Okay.
Think about the U.S. approach to rebuilding defeated countries.
Right.
After World War II, there was a fairly standardized approach for Germany and Japan. But as we've seen in more recent situations like Grenada, Panama, and Haiti, that approach evolved and adapted.
Interesting.
So you start with a basic recipe, and then you adjust based on what you have and what you're trying to achieve.
Makes sense. So the beauty of standardized strategies is that they buy you time to develop a more tailored approach
Exactly.
while still providing a framework for action.
You got it.
It's like having a solid foundation to build on.
Yeah.
You're not starting from scratch every time.
No, you're not.
And for our listeners in the USMC, think about how standardized strategies might be used to maintain readiness
Yeah,
for a range of potential conflicts.
absolutely.
You have to be prepared for anything.
You do.
And having those pre-built frameworks can be invaluable.
Absolutely. Now, let's talk about strategy by intent
Yeah.
versus strategy by default.
This one sounds particularly intriguing.
Oh, it is.
What's the difference?
A strategy by intent is exactly what it sounds like.
Okay.
A deliberately crafted plan, carefully analyzing options and making conscious, rational decisions.
All right.
Strategy by default, however, is more reactive,
Okay.
often driven by circumstances, ideologies, or even unconscious biases that limit options.
So intent is like having a roadmap,
Yeah.
while default is like wandering through the woods and hoping you stumble upon your destination.
Perfect analogy.
Okay.
A great example is the Soviet Union's response to the German invasion in World War II.
Okay.
Their intent was to defend at the border,
Okay.
but the sheer force of the German army forced them into a strategy of retreat and attrition.
Oh, wow.
Their initial intent was overridden by the circumstances.
That makes sense. Sometimes the best laid plans.
Exactly. And ideology can play a huge role in shaping strategy by default.
Interesting.
Think about coalition warfare.
Okay.
You might have multiple nations with a shared objective,
Okay.
but their ideologies and motivations can lead to conflicts and compromises.
Right.
That wouldn't happen in a purely intent-driven strategy.
It's like herding cats.
Yeah.
Everyone has their own agenda. Getting them all to move in the same direction can be a real challenge.
Very true, and this is something for our listeners to reflect on.
Right.
Can you think of historical examples where strategies might have been driven more by default than deliberate intent?
It's a valuable exercise
Yes,
in understanding the complexities of strategic thinking.
absolutely.
It really highlights how important it is to be aware of the factors, both conscious and unconscious,
Yes,
that can influence decision-making.
that's right.
And now we come full circle back to evaluating opposing strategies.
Right, and that's what all these sets of opposites are really about.
Okay.
It's about understanding what both sides are doing and why they're doing it.
Okay.
How those actions create the dynamics of a conflict.
So we're not just looking at what pieces each side has on the board.
Right.
We're trying to understand their overall game plan,
Yes.
their motivations,
Yeah.
and their potential weaknesses.
Exactly. We need to ask those fundamental questions.
Okay.
What are their political objectives? Are they limited or unlimited?
Yeah.
How do they perceive each other's objectives?
And we need to recognize that not everything is fixed.
Right.
Some elements of a situation are constants,
Uh-huh.
but others can change.
Yes.
It's a strategist's job to figure out which is which.
Absolutely.
What are the fixed elements they need to work around?
Yeah.
And what are the potential areas of change they can exploit?
Exactly.
It's like a giant puzzle where some of the pieces are glued in place
Right.
and others can be moved around.
Yes.
You have to figure out how to solve it, even with those limitations.
You got it.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground.
We have.
And that brings us to the end of part 1
Okay.
of our deep dive into MCDP 101 Chapter 3.
We've only just scratched the surface.
We have.
Join us in part 2 as we delve even deeper into the complexities of strategic thinking.
It only gets better from here, folks. Welcome back to our deep dive into MCDP 101 Chapter 3. We just finished talking about evaluating opposing strategies and how crucial it is to understand those dynamics between those strategic opposites.
Absolutely.
So let's build on that.
Okay.
We've got a grasp of these strategic opposites,
Okay.
but how do we put them into practice?
Right.
What's the next step in analyzing a situation?
Well, the chapter really hammers home the need to understand each side's political objectives.
Okay.
That's the heart of any conflict, the driving force behind every move.
It's about figuring out what they're fighting for, their ultimate goals.
Right.
Are they trying to conquer territory, secure resources, topple a regime, or simply defend themselves?
Exactly. And just as important is understanding how each side perceives the other's objectives.
Oh, okay.
Misperceptions and miscalculations can lead to escalation and unintended consequences.
Right.
Imagine a country bolstering its defenses because they believe their neighbor is about to invade,
Okay.
when in reality, that neighbor is just trying to deter aggression.
Oh, wow.
That misunderstanding can spiral out of control.
It's like that classic game of telephone
Yeah.
where a message gets distorted as it's passed along.
Right.
In a conflict, if you misunderstand your enemy's intentions, you might react in a way that makes the situation far worse.
Precisely. It's crucial to gather accurate intelligence, analyze it carefully, and avoid making assumptions based on biases or preconceived notions.
You have to be willing to question your own assumptions
Absolutely.
and try to see the situation from the other side's perspective.
You got it.
Now, the chapter also talks about distinguishing between limited and unlimited political objectives.
Okay.
Can you explain the difference?
Limited objectives are specific and achievable goals.
Right.
Think securing a border, limiting a territory, forcing a regime change.
Okay.
Unlimited objectives are far more expansive,
Okay.
often involving the complete subjugation or annihilation of the enemy.
So limited is like aiming for a field goal,
Okay.
while unlimited is like going for a touchdown every single play.
Yeah,
Except the stakes are a lot higher than a football game.
that's a great analogy.
Right.
And the type of objective a side is pursuing has a huge impact on the strategies they employ
Right.
and the overall nature of the conflict.
Makes sense.
A side aiming for total victory is likely to be far more aggressive, willing to take greater risks even at the cost of higher casualties.
So understanding whether your enemy has limited or unlimited objectives
Yes,
is essential for developing an effective counter strategy.
absolutely.
It's about choosing the right tools for the job. Right?
Exactly. And remember those strategic opposites we discussed earlier?
Yeah.
They come into play big time when crafting a strategy.
Okay.
Do you want to pursue a defensive or offensive strategy?
Right.
A symmetrical or asymmetrical approach?
Ah.
Which tools are going to be most effective in this particular situation?
It sounds like there's no one-size-fits-all solution.
Nope.
Every conflict is unique.
Yes.
Every strategy needs to be tailored to the situation.
That's absolutely right. And that's what makes strategic thinking so challenging and so rewarding.
Yeah.
It's not about memorizing formulas or following a set playbook.
Right.
It's about analyzing, adapting, and making tough decisions based on incomplete information.
It's about using your brain, not just your brawn.
You got it.
And that's something the Marine Corps has always excelled at.
They have.
Being mentally agile, being able to think on your feet, adjust your plans as the situation evolves.
Yes. This isn't just for generals, is it?
No.
Strategic thinking is a skill every Marine can develop.
Absolutely.
It's not something you're born with. It takes practice study and a willingness to challenge your own assumptions.
And one of the best ways to develop your strategic thinking skills is to study history.
Oh, absolutely.
Look at past conflicts,
Yes.
analyze the decisions that were made, and try to understand why things unfolded the way they did.
It's like having a laboratory full of experiments you can learn from.
Right.
Successes, failures, everything is a learning opportunity.
So don't just read about history, engage with it.
Yeah.
Put yourself in the shoes of the decision makers.
Yeah.
And ask yourself, what would I have done differently?
Yes.
What were their options? And why did they choose the path they did?
And don't be afraid to debate and discuss these things with your fellow Marines.
Right.
The more perspectives you consider, the richer your own understanding will become.
It's all about bouncing ideas off of each other.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, let's turn our attention to one of the most critical aspects of strategic thinking.
Okay.
Deterrence.
Deterrence. The art of preventing conflict through the threat of force.
Yes.
It's that old saying, speak softly and carry a big stick.
Right.
Except in this case, the big stick might be a very real, very powerful military force.
Exactly. Deterrence is about convincing your opponent that the costs of aggression will outweigh any potential benefits.
Okay.
And as we touched on earlier, there are two main methods,
Right.
denial and reprisal.
Right. Denial is about making it clear that any attack will fail,
Yes.
while reprisal is about threatening to inflict unacceptable damage and retaliation.
You got it.
It's about having a credible force. A force your opponent knows you're willing to use.
Precisely. And the effectiveness of deterrence depends on several key factors.
Okay.
First, your opponent must believe that you have the capability to carry out your threats.
Right.
They need to know that you have the firepower, the manpower, the logistical support to back up your words.
It's not enough to just talk tough.
No.
You have to be able to walk the walk.
Absolutely. Second, they must believe you have the will to use that force.
Okay.
If they think you're bluffing, they might be tempted to call your bluff.
Right.
Deterrence is a mind game.
Yeah.
It's about psychology, communication, and a deep understanding of your opponent.
You need to project strength and resolve, but without being overly provocative.
That's right.
It's about getting inside their heads and figuring out what makes them tick,
Yes.
what they value,
Yeah.
what they fear, what keeps them up at night.
Exactly. And that's why intelligence gathering and analysis are so crucial for effective deterrence.
Yeah, you got to know what they're
You
thinking.
need to know your opponent as well as you know yourself.
It's like playing a high-stakes game of chess,
Yeah.
where you're trying to anticipate your opponent's moves before they make them.
That's a great analogy. And just like in chess, there are different levels of deterrence.
Oh.
You can deter a specific action, like an invasion of a particular territory,
Right.
or you can deter a broader range of actions, like any aggression against your allies or interests.
So it's not just about preventing an all-out war.
No.
It's about shaping the behavior of your opponents.
Yes.
and creating a more stable strategic environment.
Exactly. And that brings us to another key point.
Okay.
Communication.
Okay.
Deterrence isn't just about having a powerful military. It's also about communicating your intentions,
Okay.
your red lines clearly and effectively.
So it's not just about what you do.
Right.
It's about what you say and how you say it.
Precisely.
So you're saying it's like putting up a beware of dog sign.
Okay.
You're letting people know that there are consequences for trespassing. But if people know your dog is a tiny chihuahua, they're not going to be very deterred.
Exactly. The effectiveness of your communication depends on its credibility.
It's got to be believable.
You need to back up your words with actions, demonstrate that you're serious about enforcing those red lines.
Okay.
That's where things like military exercises, deployments, even limited military strikes can come into play.
Okay.
They're not just about projecting power.
Yeah.
They're also about sending a message.
It's about showing your opponent that you're not bluffing, that you're willing to do what it takes to protect your interests.
Precisely, deterrence is a complex and nuanced aspect of strategic thinking.
It sounds like it.
For our listeners in the USMC, consider how you can apply these principles of deterrence in your own roles and responsibilities.
That's a good point.
Whether you're a squad leader or a general, understanding these concepts can help you make better decisions
Right.
and contribute to a more stable and secure world.
Absolutely. And remember, deterrence is not a static concept.
It's constantly evolving and requires vigilance and adaptation.
Yes.
What worked yesterday might not work tomorrow. So stay informed, analyze the changing strategic environment, and adjust your approach accordingly.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
It's all about being proactive, not reactive.
Right.
Anticipating threats, identifying vulnerabilities, and taking steps to mitigate those risks before they become crises.
Okay, that's good advice.
Which leads us nicely into another set of strategic opposites we need to explore.
Okay.
Standardized versus tailored strategies.
All right, let's delve into that.
Right.
Can you remind us about the difference between a standardized strategy and a tailored one?
A standardized strategy is a pre-planned approach for a particular type of situation.
Okay.
It's like having a playbook for different scenarios, great for when you need to respond quickly,
Right.
or for problems you've encountered before.
So it's about having those go-to solutions ready at hand.
Exactly. Tailored strategies are custom designed to fit the specific circumstances of a situation.
They need more time and analysis to develop, but can be more effective in dealing with unique or complex challenges.
So it's about taking a more nuanced approach,
Right.
considering all the variables,
Right.
and crafting a plan specifically for that particular problem.
You got it.
But how do you choose between the two?
The choice between a standardized and a tailored strategy depends on several factors.
Okay.
First, the nature of the situation.
All right.
Is it a familiar problem or something new and unexpected?
If it's a known enemy, a known terrain, a known type of operation,
Yeah.
a standardized approach might work well.
Yes. But if you're dealing with something completely different, you need to take a more tailored approach.
Okay.
Second, consider the time available.
Yeah.
Do you have time to develop a detailed plan, or do you need to act quickly?
Sometimes you got to move.
In a crisis situation, you might not have the luxury of spending weeks or months developing a tailored strategy.
You need to act decisively using the tools and knowledge you have available.
Right. And third, consider the resources available. Do you have the intelligence, the personnel, the equipment to implement a tailored strategy?
Gotcha.
If not, you might have to rely on a more standardized approach.
So it's not just about what you want to do.
Right.
It's about what you're capable of doing.
Yeah.
You need to be realistic about your limitations.
Absolutely. The key is finding the right balance between standardization and tailoring.
Okay.
You don't want to be so rigid that you can't adapt to changing circumstances,
Right.
but you also don't want to reinvent the wheel every time you face a challenge.
It's about having a solid foundation to build on,
Yes.
but being willing to make adjustments as needed.
Exactly. And one of the best examples of this balance can be seen in the U.S. military's approach to air power.
Okay.
They have standardized procedures for things like close air support and interdiction,
Okay.
but they also have the flexibility to tailor their tactics and techniques
Okay.
to the specific circumstances of each mission.
So they have that playbook, but aren't afraid to improvise when necessary.
Precisely. And that's what makes them so effective.
I see.
They have the discipline to follow established procedures when it makes sense, but they also have the creativity and adaptability to think outside the box
Right.
when the situation demands it.
And for our listeners in the USMC,
Yes.
think about how this balance between standardization and tailoring applies to your own roles and responsibilities.
Absolutely.
Whether you're planning a patrol or a major operation,
Right.
You need to find that sweet spot
Yeah,
between following established procedures and adapting to the specific challenges you face.
absolutely. And remember, no plan survives first contact with the enemy.
That's a good one.
So be prepared to adjust, improvise, and overcome.
Great point, which leads us to another important aspect of strategic thinking,
Okay.
the distinction between strategy by intent and strategy by default.
Ah, yes, intent versus default. This is a crucial distinction
Okay.
because it highlights the fact that not all strategies are created equal.
Okay, remind us again, what's the difference?
A strategy by intent is a plan deliberately crafted through careful analysis and consideration of options.
Okay.
It's the result of a rational decision-making process.
It's a conscious choice based on a clear understanding of the goals, the risks, and the potential outcomes.
Exactly. Strategy by default is more reactive, often driven by circumstances, ideologies, or even unconscious biases that limit the range of options considered.
So it's about reacting to events as they unfold,
Right.
rather than proactively shaping the course of events.
Precisely the danger of a strategy by default is that it can lead to unintended consequences and missed opportunities.
It's like driving a car without a map or a destination in mind.
Okay.
You might end up somewhere, but it's unlikely to be where you wanted to go.
That's a great analogy, and one of the classic examples of strategy by default is the U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War.
Oh,
The initial decisions to escalate the conflict were often driven by a combination of factors,
right.
including a fear of communism, a belief in the domino theory, and a desire to avoid the appearance of weakness.
So it wasn't necessarily a carefully calculated strategy,
Right.
but rather a series of reactions to events as they unfolded.
Exactly. And the result was a protracted and costly conflict that ultimately failed to achieve its objectives.
A cautionary tale for sure.
It is.
It shows just how important it is to be deliberate and thoughtful in your strategic decision-making.
Absolutely. And that brings us to the final point I want to emphasize.
Okay.
The need to constantly evaluate and reassess your strategy.
Okay.
The strategic environment is constantly changing,
Right.
and your strategy needs to evolve along with it.
So it's not just about coming up with a plan and sticking to it no matter what.
Right.
You need to be flexible and adaptable.
You do.
It's like navigating a ship through a storm.
Okay.
You have to constantly adjust your course to avoid the rocks and stay on track.
That's a great analogy. The key to successful navigation is having a clear understanding of your destination, your current position, and the forces that are acting upon you.
So in strategic terms, that means knowing your objectives, assessing your strengths and weaknesses, and understanding the dynamics of the situation,
You got it.
but also being willing to admit when your strategy isn't working
Absolutely.
and making the necessary changes.
Right. It's about being honest with yourself, recognizing your mistakes, and learning from them.
That's what distinguishes great strategic thinkers from mediocre ones.
Yeah.
It's not about being perfect. It's about being willing to adapt and improve.
You got it.
And for our listeners in the USMC, strategic thinking is a journey, not a destination.
It's right.
It's a skill you can develop throughout your career, and it's something that will serve you well in all aspects of your life.
Well said. And remember, the more you study, the more you practice, and the more you engage in thoughtful discussion and debate, the better you'll become at this critical skill.
That's right. Keep learning, keep challenging yourselves, and never stop thinking strategically.
Absolutely.
And that brings us to the end of part 2 of our deep dive.
Join us for part 3, where we'll put all these pieces together and explore how you can apply these principles of strategic thinking to your own experiences and future challenges as Marines.
Welcome back to the deep dive.
Part 3.
We're wrapping up our exploration of MCDP 1-to-1, Chapter 3, Strategic Opposites.
All right.
In parts 1 and 2, we really dug into strategic thinking.
Yeah, we did.
We covered those crucial strategic opposites,
Mm-hmm.
offense versus defense, symmetrical versus asymmetrical,
Right.
intent versus default.
Yes.
We even talked about deterrence and how to make sure those threats have some teeth.
Those are important.
But it's not just theory, right?
Right. We also discussed how vital it is to truly understand your enemy.
Yes.
Their goals, their fears, how they see the world, all of that feeds into how a conflict unfolds.
Exactly. And remember, strategic thinking isn't just for generals.
No, it's not.
It's a skill every Marine at every level can and should develop.
Absolutely, because whether you're leading a fire team
Right.
or planning a major operation, these principles can make your decisions sharper
Mm-hmm.
and help you accomplish the mission more effectively.
Absolutely. So in this final part, let's make it practical.
Okay.
How can you, as Marines, apply these concepts in the real world?
All right.
How do you take this knowledge and put it into action?
One of the most important things is to make strategic thinking a habit.
Okay.
Don't just react to events as they happen.
Right.
Take that step back, analyze the situation, try to anticipate what might happen next.
Be proactive, not reactive.
Exactly.
Think ahead, play out different scenarios in your mind.
Yes.
And be ready to adapt your plans on the fly, especially in the military where the stakes are so high.
Couldn't agree more, and don't be afraid to ask questions.
Right.
Challenge assumptions, seek out different perspectives.
Yeah.
The more you question and explore, the deeper your understanding will become.
Remember, on the battlefield, lives depend on clear thinking.
Absolutely.
It's like that old saying, the only stupid question is the one that isn't asked.
Precisely. And another critical piece of advice, learn from history.
Okay, history is important.
Study past conflicts, both the wins and the losses. Analyze the decisions that were made and really try to grasp why things played out the way they did.
It's like having a vast library of case studies at your fingertips.
Exactly. And don't just focus on the big battles that everyone knows.
Right.
Study the smaller engagements, the ones that might not have made it into the history books.
Okay.
There's something to learn at every level of conflict.
Makes sense. And don't just read about it, talk it out.
Yes.
Discuss it with other Marines, share your insights, and learn from their experiences.
That's right. Iron sharpens iron.
The more perspectives you consider, the sharper your own strategic thinking will become.
Remember, strategic thinking isn't just about winning wars.
Right.
It's about preventing them.
It's about creating a more stable and secure world where conflicts are less likely to happen in the first place.
Exactly.
And that's a goal worth striving for.
Absolutely.
So as you continue your careers, remember these principles.
Okay.
Think strategically, analyze every situation carefully,
Yes.
and never underestimate the power of a well-crafted plan.
And above all, stay adaptable. Stay curious. Never stop learning.
Right.
The world is constantly changing.
It is.
And you need to be prepared to change right along with it.
Well said. And with that, we've reached the end of our deep dive into MCDP 1.1 Chapter 3.
It's been a good one.
We hope exploring these strategic opposites has been valuable and that you'll carry these lessons with you in the Marine Corps and beyond.
Semper Fi Marines, keep those minds sharp.
And thanks for joining us on the deep dive.